Today I'm going to show you how to put the cover knot on and how to make the foundation for that knot. I do it slightly differently from other people as per usual, so look around, see which method is going to work best for you. I actually got this method from Ron Edwards' book, How to Make Whips. It's this one. I showed it in the theory video. Excellent book. I'm going to go through today as well some other books which I found very useful, and one which was recommended which I didn't find very useful at all, but we'll get to that in a bit. So here's the whip, and yeah, so it's all pretty much there apart from the end bit. Now you can see here I've chopped off that inch which was had the hole in it, and I've melted everything together. Now the way I like to build up my my foundation for the knot to go around is I like to do it with wood glue and string. Now you might be thinking, oh my god, he's using wood glue and string, but actually, like I say, it is a traditional technique used in leather making whips, and it gives you an awful lot of control about the shape of your foundation, and when everything is set, it's a very strong way of doing things. Before I build up the foundation though, what I like to do is to bind on the piece of cord that I'm going to be using for making the knot. So I have that here, and I've got this cut at 80 inches long. That's 80 inches long. That's probably a little bit too long. I've done it with shorter lengths in the past, but this length will allow you to put it on, because I'm going to show you how to do it with a mandrel, which is quite a lot easier than just sewing it on, especially for a beginner. How do I attach it? Well, you can attach it using your normal binding, so using the synthetic sinew here. But actually, usually what I end up using is this stuff. This is B50 bowstring material, which is a very, very strong and very thin thread. I also use it for the material for the poppers and that kind of thing. The reason why I like to use this for binding this section on is because A, it's very strong, so I can pull on it to a high degree, and it also digs in quite a little bit, which I think gives a bit more resistance to our thread ever wanting to be pulled out. Having said that, we are going to be putting an awful lot of stuff on top of this. It's going to be bound and set and all sorts of stuff, so the likelihood of it coming out is quite low, but you know, every little helps, I guess. So the first thing I'm going to do is just hunt around the edge of the whip here, and you can see here there's a little bit where I've cut it off. I've cut it off with an angle grinder just because it's quicker, but you can use a hacksaw or whatever you like. But you can see here where I've melted, there's like a little patch which is kind of lower than everything else, and so that's where I'm going to stick this bit, which is the sort of melted end, and I'm going to bind down about an inch or 3/4 of an inch, say. Let's say an inch. I'm going to bind around an inch down, and it doesn't have to be continuous. You just need enough on there to make sure it's not coming off. So I'm going to take my thread, and I'm going to start with a clove hitch, because I like clove hitch. This might be a bit difficult to tie one-handed, but I shall persevere. So yeah, a lot of the time I'd be doing this kind of thing over a board, and there's a few bits I'm actually doing slightly differently today. I have ironed the cord on the same setting as you would for nylon, because it's nylon, and that's just to see if it makes things easier. I'm pretty sure it will. When you're tying these knots, you have to make sure there's no twist in it, and if you do get a twist in it, it takes a while to sort of work that through and get everything to sit nicely. So what I'm doing here is I'm putting a half hitch on. So I've put my clove hitch on, and now I'm going to put a half hitch on, which is just twisting it like that and putting it over the end. Now I'm just going to do a sort of a combination of that and binding around to make sure this is very strongly attached. You can see here where I've melted it has created a little bead which will help prevent it from being pulled out. So I'm going to bind to about 1 inch, come back up the way a bit, and then I'll finish that off just with a few half hitches. Again, apologies if the camera's wobbling a little bit, it's attached to the desk, and when my lathe is ready I'll be machining up a new camera mount. So yeah, 3 half hitches, why not? The other reason why I like this thread is also because it's synthetic. You can chop it and melt it in the same way as you can with the nylon. Now, like I say, I'm putting on cotton string soaked in wood glue to make up the foundation. But I don't want to get any of that glue on this thread, and I certainly don't want to get any of it onto the whip itself. So I'm actually going to use the dreaded insulation tape. This is going to come back off again, but I'm just going to use this as masking to prevent any glue going in the wrong place. So I'm going to start underneath that thread there. And I like to come like a couple of millimeters lower, is that like 1/32 lower than the bottom of the binding. At least once, and quite tightly, to protect the handle underneath. And then, because I also don't want it on the glue either, I don't want glue on this cord either, I'm also going to cover that over, and then just work my way down. The other thing this does is prevent this thread from touching where we're putting glue onto the whip. Okay, so this is new for me as well. This is usually what I do is just cover the end of the whip here in glue, wind on a layer, and then cover in glue as well, and that's fine. That works quite well. But I made this thing yesterday, and hopefully this will help me do it a little bit without spilling glue, dripping glue on places. So all this is just a jam jar with a ball of string in. I've got the free running end running up through what is a blocking grommet used for electrical installations, with a small hole in it which I've pushed the string through, and then I filled the entire thing with undiluted wood glue and left it for what must be about 24-36 hours now, just to make sure it's good and soaked. Now, to make sure that everything sticks down, there's a decent amount of glue in there. I'm actually going to use the same method as I did before, as I usually do, at the same time, just to make sure there's absolutely no problems. The only reason why I'm doing this is A, to keep mess down a little bit, and just to make sure everything's absolutely saturated when we're doing it. So yeah, got my wood glue here. So the first thing I'm going to do is just put a small covering. Oh, hang on, before I start, I'm going to make sure I've got some something to clean my hands with. So I'm going to start by putting a bit of glue on the end here, and just making sure that there's good coverage all the way around. Wood glue is quite a good choice for this because it's made so that you can actually steam wooden joints and still bend them once it's set. So it sets up nice and waterproof, and actually it sets up stronger than the wood itself. So if you're putting it in a matrix like this with the string, it makes quite an effective foundation. Okay, so I've got my string here, and what I like to do is to start from the top and to work round. Now it's not going to stick to itself massively when you first put it on. You need to kind of work it round until you've got over your first edge, like so. And then all I'm going to do is wind on just like so. Just making sure there's no gaps. And then the gap. When I get to the bottom here, when there's not any room for another layer because of the masking, I'm then going to come back up onto the previous layer and work my way back along. Now, if you're not using this thing which has soaked the string in glue, and actually just because I want to be absolutely sure it's all sticking, before you go back up you want to kind of cover the whole thing in a layer of glue again. Now that I'm sure, I'm just going to work my way back up again. Now, how many layers you do might be determined a little bit by the thickness of your string. This is actually quite a thick cotton string, so I'm not having to do that many layers, but you probably need less layers than you think, especially if you're just doing a small 5x4, is it 4x5, I can't remember, handle knot. So once I've got up to the top here, I'm just going to snip it off. I'm not going to do a knot or anything like that. The glue will hold it, the knot above it will hold it. So I'm just going to try and sort of smooth that into everything, and then once again, just to be on the safe side, make sure that everything's properly held, I'm going to go over with glue again. Now the reason I like doing this method is exactly this, like you can control the shape of your knot really easily. I like to have quite a small rounded knot, but I have done other knots, sort of larger knots as well, where you get a bit more room to do artistic stuff. So okay, so there we have it for the time being. What I'm going to do now is just leave this to dry just for a couple of hours. I like actually I use a cotton tape over this, and I'll show you that in a bit. I like to leave this for a couple of hours, but I don't like to leave it till it's completely set before I put the knot over the top. It doesn't make that much difference, but actually, if you imagine your knot is wanting to constrict in a circular manner, if this still hasn't set up quite properly, it means that it will allow the knot to constrict this foundation into the shape it wants to be, and then as the glue sets, everything will be held nicely. So while that's setting up, I'm just going to go through the way I tie this knot and how to make a mandrel. What is a mandrel? Well, mandrel essentially is just a piece of wood with some pins in it, and it's got a representation of how the knot is going to be tied. I don't actually use pins, I just use these screws, and they only go in with like a turn and a half or so. Whatever you put in, you want it to be removable, because once you've put the knot around this, you want to be able to take the pins out to slip it off and put it onto whatever you're covering with. So yeah, I think I literally just took a large needle or a nail or something. I can't. It's so long since I made this thing, and just pushed in a little starter hole. And as you can see, I don't even need a screwdriver to put these in or take them out. But essentially, yeah, that's what a mandrel is. Now, it's not very clear how everything goes on here. And so what I have here is a flat representation. If you imagine these two ends are actually joined together, so this thing is a circle. And the X's on here denote where, as you're going along, you would pass under a strand. So this would be over and this would be under. But it's not quite as simple as just being able to look at it and going, oh yeah, over, under, over, under, over, under type thing. Because it's in the order with which we're stitching the thing. So you've got your start here, and so you've got your different pins around your mandrel, labelled as such. You would start here just before pin 1, and you'd go all the way up over pin 3. You'd come down here, which follows along from here. Is that right? Yeah, so this one here, and then you're going to come around here. So we're going over the first strand here, we're coming up and then down, and then from there we're coming down. Now this will be the first time we're going under something, because this is actually, all this section hasn't happened yet. If you imagine that, like we haven't actually stitched that bit, so there's nothing there just yet. But here is our first strand, and that's where we want to go underneath, and then round. So basically you keep following it round until you get to the finish, and every time you come across an X, you're going under. I'll show you a little bit more later on about how to use the mandrel, but I just quickly wanted to go through a couple of books which I think you'll find useful. Well, one which you'll find useful, and one which is probably a bad idea for a beginner. So the first one we have here is Encyclopedia of Rawhide and Leather Braiding, and this has been an incredibly useful book. It doesn't go much into whip making, to be honest, but it has so many different knots and plates and different ways of working and things you can do for your handle and handle loops and all sorts of stuff. I mean, yeah, it's even got stuff about how to make, like, you know, braces and horse tack and all sorts of stuff. But there are so many different bits in this book which I found incredibly useful. It wasn't all that expensive, and it's a very hard wearing book. Like, this book has been with me around Australia. I lent it to a friend who also took it around Australia, so this has probably been around Australia twice. And it's held up very well, and you can see from the grease stains and bits and pieces I've well used this book, and yeah, it's an excellent book. The one which I wouldn't recommend so much, which people have recommended to me, is this one. This is the Ashley Book of Knots, and it's, to my mind, it's far more a historical kind of listing of knots than it is really a practical help. It does show you how to tie the knots, but not very well, and it's got so many described in there, it can be hard to find what knot is relevant to you. a lot of the knots are kind of out of use now. You know, I mean, if you want to know how to knot a donkey so that you can hang it from a sling and load it into a ship, you know, have at it. But that's beyond the scope of what I want to learn particularly. The other thing is it's an expensive book. I mean, I think it was like 50 quid or something on eBay. And it's not a particularly well made book. Like I've treated this very carefully because it's an expensive book. I've not read it that much because it hasn't been that useful. And it's only like a year or two old, and already you can see here the glue has come away. The binding's gone. And actually on this page here you can see that it doesn't really go into a great deal of detail on how to tie the different knots. Yeah, it's more a kind of history book, I feel, than a practical kind of this is how to tie the knots and the structure of those knots. But that's my opinion. Other people may find it very useful. But I would say if you're starting out and you're limited on funds, this is not the one to start with. A couple hours later now, and I'm just going to remove the masking and do one more process before I'm ready to start tying the heel knot. So, there we go. Now, before I tie the heel knot, what I want to do, I usually use this stuff. This is a cloth tape. I actually use it mainly for trapeze bars, for handles on trapezes, but essentially what it is a sticky back cotton tape. And the only reason why I'm putting this on is so that when I'm tying off this knot, I'm not having glue or anything else squeezed through, because remember, this isn't completely set up yet. I've done this so that it's squashy. I'm not having glue squished through, and also it allows the needle, which I'll be using to thread the knot and also to tie it off, it allows it to slip past without catching or going underneath any of these strands. So the first thing I like to do is just take a square of this stuff, and just place it over the top like so. And then I cut round in a circle to get roughly the right kind of shape. Okay, I'm just going to pull the edges down. I don't want it to wrinkle up too much, but if it wrinkles a little bit, that's not a problem. And like I say, I just really want one layer over this so that the needle can slide over the top without catching on anything. Now this tape I've got is about 2 inches wide, so it's a bit too wide for what I want to do. So generally I kind of cut a kind of 1/2 inch, centimetre and a half strip. I'll cut a few of these, and then in a similar way to how I'm actually going to tie the knot, I'm just going to go around from the top to the bottom. And I'll keep doing that until everything's covered. I don't want to build up the knot too much, but I do want it all covered. And again, this isn't essential. You could just leave the glue on its own overnight, give it 24, 48 hours to set up. nearly got it all covered. I've just got one last little bit round here. I suppose these strips are about 100mm, 4 inches, maybe 5 inches. I'm a man, so that's probably 3 inches in reality. We tend to overestimate these things. Okay, there we go. So once this is on there, I'm about ready to start putting my knot over the top of this one. Okay, so I've got my mandrel here and I've got my lacing needle. As I mentioned in the tools video, this is one I've actually filed down just to make it easier to pass through. Just be careful when you're doing that, because obviously it's got a hole at the back here, and if you file down too much, you're in danger of kind of losing the bit which is going to grip on to your paracord. I've prepared this piece here. What I've done is just kind of melted it into sort of a T shape, and then to put it into the lacing needle, usually what I do is kind of fold that over till it's running sideways, put it in like that, and then if you pull on the end of it, it's going to want to straighten up inside the hole, which it doesn't have enough room to do. So it's going to kind of hold it quite nicely in there. Okay, so in order to tie my knot with the mandrel, obviously I've tied this on here. So I'm just going to place the mandrel above, like so, and then I'm going to follow around the pattern that's on it here. So going up under that one, over that one, down around that one, over that one. Just have to check. No, I'm not passing underneath. Around that one. Here we go. So this is the first one here. I need to pass underneath that one. So I'm going to thread along until I get my needle. Try and keep everything nice and flat, but invariably you'll get a tangle. Slipped off there. Going down under that one. I think I have to under that one. I'm going to move my cup of tea. I've managed to spill tea on 2 computers in as many weeks. And there we are, just at the finish point now. So this first time round I'm just going to do it in one pass. So once you've completed once, I'm then going to take this knot off, place it onto where I want it, pull all the slack through and place the threads nicely, and then I'll keep going round, so I'll do this another 2 times after this. So once you're at this point, you've come back to your start point, you can then take out your pins. And there's probably better videos describing this. Have a look through. You might want to do a different knot on the end, but this is a great one to start off with. And the nice thing about this knot is that you can do it with or without a handle loop if you want to. So there's my knot. I'm going to place that over the end of the handle like that, and then I'm going to work from this end, and every time I go round, the following ones are going to go on top of these ones, which means that when I come to the top here, I want to leave quite a bit of space. And at the moment I don't really want to pull too tight, because if I pull too tight before all the threads are in place, before all the cord is in place, all it's going to do is pull them to the wrong place really. It's not going to help all that much, and then you end up with strands overlapping each other. I would say, especially when you start, it's far more important to have a sturdy knot that's not going to come off than a pretty one. Well, obviously if you're making things for other people, if you end up with a particularly ugly knot, you're going to have to take it off and redo it. So this can be a little bit confusing, but just keep working through. So I'm going to keep these fairly open for the time being at the top here. This will close up completely by the time we're done. But until my threads are placed, I want to make sure that I'm covering at the top and I'm covering at the bottom. Now when you finish this, if you have some gaps in your knot, there are things you can do about that, and I'll go into that later on. This particular one is a little bit on the small side, so I'm more likely to get bunching than I am not getting enough coverage. Okay, so I'm back round to the start, and I've got it sort of reasonably tight. I mean, I've taken most of the slack out, but I still want it to be fairly loose, because like I say, I don't want to pull these out of place. I'm trying to make kind of a square at the top here. And I'm trying to make sure that I've got decent coverage around the bottom here as well. Once you're happy with it, you can pull through a little bit more. The other thing is as you go and do more and more passes on this knot, the action of putting more cord underneath these layers will have a tightening effect in itself. There, you see I've pulled a little bit too hard on that one. So just make sure it's kind of set properly where I want it. Okay, so now I'm going to carry on following round. I'm going to do 2 more passes on this. Probably a bit of adjustment as I go as well. And if you get a fold, make sure you get it out. The sooner you get the twists out, better, because if you have to follow a twist 3 times around this knot, it's going to drive you a bit crazy. And again, try and make sure that it can line nicely next to itself. You see this piece of string here, it's piece of cord here. If I pull too tightly on that now, it's going to move away from where it should be. Okay, so I'm back round to the start again, and as you can see I've got some bunching on the top, little gaps, just tiny ones here, but I'm not fully tight on the tension just yet, so I'm just going to take the needle off so that it's not banging around. See how firmly that gets on there. And I'm going to snip this sort of reasonably short. So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to follow round, and I'm just going to arrange everything as I go round and tighten up slightly each pass. So remember, this is where we've just finished, so our first way round is just here. Now as I go around this time, I can kind of move things around a little bit. And as I'm doing that, I can tighten up. And as I tighten up, that will take a little bit of the area of coverage away as well, which will help me get rid of some of this bunching at the top. So, pretty much there. I'm still going to go through and tighten up a bit more. I'm not completely happy with the way this top's gone in, so I'm going to work on that a little bit more. And yeah, I mean, if you're making this for yourself and you end up with a small gap, say you can see here, because I haven't finished this bit quite yet, but say you end up with like a tiny gap like that or something, you can just go in with a marker if you want to, and just colour that in the same colour as the surrounding whip, as the surrounding cord. The other thing you can do is you can go around with another colour thread, and you can do that by design as well. So like the whip in the thumbnail, I went round either side. I only did a one pass knot, and then went in with thin nylon thread. And it has to be nylon because you don't want it to shrink at a different rate if you're going to be waxing the thing. If you're not going to be waxing it, it doesn't matter as much. But you can go and do another pass in thinner thread. You don't have to do each pass in the same colour either. But if you're going to do it in different colours, I would suggest starting them all off in the same way next to each other, so tied to the actual inside of the handle. So I'm going to work on a little bit now. I'm going to just try and get things a little bit neater, and then I'll come back to you in a bit and show you how I secure this end of the knot. Okay. Complete disclosure, I wasn't particularly happy with the way that had closed up before, so I actually been in now off camera and retied it. The only difference with retying it was I started my my original knot a little bit further out, and I didn't have to completely retie it. I just took out the last two passes and rearranged the first pass so that it would close up a little bit nicer. It happens sometimes. Sometimes you have to go back through and change things, particularly if you're filming them on YouTube. So anyway, so this is how I'm going to close up the knot. I've got this last piece here, and what I want it to do is to go under this strand here, and I want a decent amount of excess, so so that it's held by what's underneath it, what will go over the top of it. I mentioned in the tools video that I'll be using these needles backwards sometimes, and this is the application where I use them backwards. So what I'm going to do is go in this joint here. I'm going to push out here, and then I'll show you what I do after that. So I'm going to come in here under all these strands, just try and work my way through until I can get outside of the place where I want to be. Okay, so I want this strand ending up on the inside of here. I don't want it to pull out of the knot itself, but I'd quite like it to finish around here or so. So I'm going to chop it off there. Just double check that. Yep, looks about right. I'm going to melt off the end, and this time around I'm going to melt the end and I'm going to squish it flat, because I want everything to lie as flat as possible underneath the knot. And then in order to pull it through, I'm going to need a thread through this piece here. So I'm going to pass a needle with some of this strong thread on it through that piece like that. I'll double that over, and I'll take both ends and push them through here. So both those ends go through that needle. And that's why it's useful to have quite a wide eye on the needle. Invariably it doesn't want to go. There we go. So both those are through, and all I'm going to do now is withdraw this needle so that I have my threads sticking out the other end. And that gives me something to pull on here to draw this inside, but I want it to go in straight. And so usually what I like to do is to hold on here, and I want these to pull kind of straight forward like that. So I'm going to pull from here, and when I get to the point at which it's going to disappear, I'm just going to use either my fid or the end of the lacing needle here just to help massage that underneath everything else, just like so. I'm going to pull that tight, and now I'm going to have to spend a little bit of time working these threads around, because remember, I've created a space here, so I need that space to be closed up. Now at this point, when you've got it nice and neat, you can just take one of these ends and pull it off. I actually leave that piece in place until after I've done the waxing, just in case anything shifts during the waxing and I need to rearrange things. It gives me a little bit more control to be able to pull on that again and keep it in place. But essentially, if you're not going to wax your whip, we're pretty much done. There's one more video which would be good for you to watch, and that's how to attach a popper and a cracker. For me though, waxing a whip makes such a huge difference that I do it to every whip. I really much prefer the feel of them. It adds a lot of weight to the whip. It means that they're a lot more durable in terms of weather and waterproofing, and it just makes for a nicer feel. Yeah, so that will be the next video, but I do appreciate that that's not something that everyone wants to do. So if you like, if your knot is nice and tight and it's nice and neat, you can then pull on one of these and remove that last piece, and then your whip is pretty much complete. The last thing I would do is give it another roll, yeah, and then go out and play with it safely, of course. Okay, that's enough for today. I'll come back and do a waxing video at some point. Thanks for watching.